name is Natalie Dielman. I am a programming coordinator at the Way Public Library in Perrysburg, Ohio, and a U2 fan, of course. And I'm so excited to welcome you to this session, Into the Garden of Dreams, the changing meaning of U2's Until the End of the World in Wim Wenders' compilation film score. This will be presented by Neil Coulter, who is an ethnomusicologist from Illinois. He spent 12 years in community development and music fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. He is now assistant professor of world arts at Dallas International University in Texas. He and his wife have 3 sons who have listened to a lot of U2 as they've grown up. That's goals, definitely. He is a lifelong fan of U2 and a lifelong fan of film music, and he's excited to bring those 2 loves together in today's presentation.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Scott, Diane, and all the team for making this conference happen. I'm really excited to be here. I've got some slides, so I'm going to share the screen and we'll get going. All right, give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that. Okay, great. So this is a presentation about film music, and we'll be looking at some important points of development in the history of film score, and then focusing specifically on Until the End of the World, the film by Wim Wenders and the song by U2. I hope at the end of the presentation, you'll have a deeper understanding of how songs can be used in movies, how a song can become a part of the filmmaker's palette for creating meaning, and some ways we might think about U2 songs used in films. So as we look at film music history here at the beginning, you might wonder what this has to do with U2 studies. And so I want to suggest a few themes that you'll hear that I believe are very relevant to the band we love. First, that innovations in technology influence cultural concepts, which are reflected in music and film. Second, the way we purchase and consume film and music influences the way films and music are created. Third, visual style influences sound and vice versa. And fourth, choices in filmmaking and music production may sometimes be made primarily by one person, but with input and limitations from many people. So listen for those themes as we go along, and then we'll bring those back at the end of the presentation for discussion. I'd like to start by asking all of you a question, and you're welcome to reply in the chat or unmute and just speak out. When have you heard a U2 song in a movie and it changed either the way you felt about the movie or the way you felt about the song?
I do remember hearing All I Want Is You in Reality Bites. And that was peak soundtrack era for me. That was a soundtrack that I loved, and I think part of it was that the song was on that soundtrack.
Yeah, that's exactly the first one I thought of that I remember U2 being in. When that comes on in the end credits, it was like, oh, suddenly I like this movie a little more. It means more to me. In fact, I was surprised. You can keep talking in the chat if you want as you think of things. Yeah, I was surprised, in fact, when I started this project, at just how many songs from U2 have appeared in movies over the years. And I knew a few, like Reality Bites was in my mind, but there were a lot more. So using information from a page on u2songs.com, and I don't know if this is thoroughly updated, but this is what they had. Here are the films that feature a song by U2 in the film, and it's quite a few, going back all the way to the 80s. So this is chronological, starting in the top left. It goes left to right and down and chronological. And these are just the films that use songs from an album, not films that had a song specially composed. So that's why Sing 2 does not appear on here. Also, I forgot about it when I was making the chart. But it's quite a few movies that U2 has appeared in over the years. And another way of looking at it is to see at a glance which albums have provided the most songs for films. And here you can see, I don't know if this surprises any of you, Joshua Tree is the top. So the number here, the first number is the number of movies that have used a song from this album. And the second number is the number of songs from the album that have appeared in movies. And so you can see Joshua Tree at the top, and All That You Can't Leave Behind, and Achtung Baby, and then on down. And I was interested to see that the most recent albums haven't, so far as I know, contributed any songs. And I guess we could theorize that that means maybe U2 is being more protective of their content. Or maybe I was also thinking that the idea of taking a U2 song and just sticking it into a movie is different than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where now U2 is a universally recognized cultural institution. And so when you put their song in the film, you're cueing all of this identity of U2. It's not just a song. So maybe filmmakers are more leery of picking and choosing a song here and there. I don't know. So how did we get to this situation though, when encountering a U2 song in the midst of a movie? It makes perfect sense. It doesn't surprise us. I ask because when I was growing up, and I was very keen on movie soundtracks, the gold standard was really John Williams, who composed all the genre movies that we loved back then. But that kind of custom composed orchestral score is a long way from a pre-existing rock song in a movie. So what changed? Or more accurately, when has this changed at various points in film history? And so that brings us to Act 1, film music overview. Soundtracks made up primarily of existing music, that is music that wasn't composed for the movie specifically, are called compiled soundtracks or compiled scores. And to trace the origin of the compiled soundtrack concept, we actually have to go all the way back to the beginning of movies. And I'll just mention here, this overview that I'm giving is hugely indebted to Julie Hubbard's great chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Film Music Studies. And anybody who's interested, highly recommend that book. It's really fascinating. So in the silent era, films, of course, needed live musical accompaniment, organ, piano, orchestra. This was most often improvised, but the content typically included existing musical selections, either in their entirety or in excerpts. So the earliest film goers were guided through the emotions of the film with the help of music that already signified certain feelings from other contexts. But there was no guarantee that an audience in Chicago was hearing a movie the same way as an audience in New York, because all the music would have been different. And still today, when you watch a silent film on Blu-ray, you often have multiple options for musical accompaniment, including scores that were written more recently. With the advent of sound films in the 1920s, the compilation soundtrack fell into disuse. Movie distributors valued uniformity as opposed to the uncontrollable variety of improvised compilation scores. And so from about the 1930 through the mid-1960s, most major films featured musical scores, especially written by composers who were brought into the filmmaking process to some extent. And in this way, the music came to represent only the film it was composed for, unencumbered by other associations. And certain composers brought their own cachet to the films they scored. So when you hear a name like Dmitri Tiomkin or Max Steiner or Bernard Herrmann, you may have very specific associations or expectations of the score even before you see the movie. And films that were scored by them are unimaginable with any other music. So here I'd like to pause again and send you to the chat again. And if you have a favorite film from the classic era, let's say the 1940s or 50s, that you feel like you love the movie and the music is just so integral, you can't hardly imagine the movie with any other music than what is there, go ahead and put that in the chat, and you can see the kinds of films we love and the kind of film music we think about. That brings us to the 1960s, when film music again changed with the start of a shift back toward the compilation score, in addition, of course, to continued newly composed orchestral scores, and sometimes a mix of the two. What changed in the 60s can be explained from multiple perspectives of different influences. First, from a cultural point of view, America loved rock and roll. The music industry was reaping great rewards from sales of rock, and the film industry began to wonder whether they might also see some of these profits from rock music by including them in the films. From an economic perspective, the film industry in this era was suffering a downturn in moviegoers and profits, especially brought on by the number of households that now owned television sets. In seeking ways to bring people back to the cinemas, film studios dismantled the old systems and hierarchies, opening the door to a younger generation of filmmakers. So this was the era of the new wave in France, neorealism in Italy, and eventually also the young generation of directors from Germany, which is where Wim Wenders will enter the scene in just a little bit. This era gave rise to the now contested concept of the auteur, the one person who is the director slash writer slash producer who exerts more control over the film than was previously typical in the older studio system. And looking back on that era, we now feel comfortable talking generally about a Francois Truffaut film or a Federico Fellini film because of the influence of that personality, that in the popular imagination, at least, they were the ones who called the shots, who did everything in the movie. The younger generation thought specifically about the music and sound in their films as a key part of their films, and many of them wanted the freedom to handpick music from their beloved rock and roll and other sources. Often the compilation scores from the 1960s and 70s were created from music the directors were listening to while filming. That's true of The Graduate, for example, where Mike Nichols was listening to Simon and Garfunkel's Sounds of Silence while making the film. And so those songs came to be intimately related to his idea of the film, and then he used them on the soundtrack. That was also the case for 2001: A Space Odyssey, where Stanley Kubrick commissioned and then rejected an original score by Alex North in favor of a compilation of existing music. The compilation scores in this era tended to be related by theme or genre. As with The Graduate's Simon and Garfunkel compilation, The Sting compiled ragtime piano music, American Graffiti compiled rock and roll, early rock and roll, over 40 songs in that movie. The Exorcist compiled contemporary classical works. And this is a good place to discuss the two ways of hearing music in a film. There's diegetic music and there's underscore. Diegetic music or source music is anything that the characters in the movie can hear. It's sometimes called source music because the source of the music is often obvious: a car stereo or a radio or a band playing live on stage. So sometimes it's clear to us as the audience that the music exists diegetically. A song can be processed to sound thinner or staticky when the characters are listening to a radio, so that we know that we're hearing the sound that they're hearing in the story. Sometimes we're less sure. So a song the characters listen, underscore music, in contrast to diegetic music, is just the music that only the audience can hear. It's not in the world of the movie that the characters can hear. It's only intended to guide our viewing in some way and help us understand the movie. And when we look at a few clips of Until the End of the World in a little bit, we'll see all these kinds of film music actually in just these few clips that use the U2 song. Another important perspective in the shift back to the compilation score is technology. As Hubbard explains in her chapter, technology is not neutral. Changes in the way we purchase and listen to music change the way we think about music. And in the 1960s, recording technology influenced film music and music listening in general. So the previous goal was high fidelity, which aimed to recreate live performance sound as closely as possible on record. And in the 1960s, it's transitioned to stereophonic sound to add greater dimensionality to the record listening experience. By the 1970s, hi-fi stereo records were well within reach of most listeners. Stereo recording was initially a bigger issue for classical music than for pop music. And so as people upgraded their home systems, many listeners also expanded their musical horizons to include new recordings of classical music. And especially that's the case for avant-garde contemporary classical music, which particularly benefited from the richer depth of stereo recording. Music companies also released new stereo versions of the older favorites in pop and rock, enticing customers to upgrade not just their home systems, but the records they already owned and loved. And I might note here that given that probably many of us have recently rebought Achtung Baby again, shows us that this remains an active and annoyingly seductive tactic in the music industry. So now in the chat, go ahead and go back to the chat, and I'd like you to share with us which U2 album you've bought the most times and how many times is it? We'll see who's the most obsessive collector here. I know for some of you, this may take some time to add it up and figure it out. Not only were recordings more interesting because of the stereo sound, but the recording process itself was becoming more complex. Studio recording to magnetic tape and eventually to multi-track tape allowed greater control and manipulation of sound en route to the final product. The idea of fidelity to any kind of original performance became less distinct as records became more the product of studio engineers than of a live performance. And the composition process wasn't finished until the recorded sounds were done being modified in the studio. And certainly all of us here who have read about U2's process of finding their way to a new song in the studio with a lot of help from the producers understands the importance of this recording revolution in U2's career also. Changes in the process of purchasing music also had an influence on listening and on the compilation score in films. People were accustomed previous to this to buying records in small record shops where a selection might be relatively limited. The mid-1960s, however, saw the advent of the music megastore, most famously Tower Records, but also others, which gave consumers access to a huge selection of musical styles. In this context, it's easy to understand why auteur filmmakers were drawn in by the fantastic selection of records available to them. So talking about The Exorcist, William Friedkin says, I went out and got the music off the records that I wanted, and it really is music score by Tower Records. And he adds, I'd rather have original Penderecki than bad Penderecki or rip-off Stravinsky. Stanley Kubrick expressed similar sentiments. He says, however good our best film composers may be, they are not a Beethoven, a Mozart, or Brahms. Why use music which is less good when there is such a multitude of great recorded orchestral music available from the past and from our own time? I think there's a lot to disagree with in those statements, but we definitely get a sense of the filmmaker's impatience and desire for control and the influence of Tower Records and of great sounding stereo recordings. So this takes us up to the 1980s, which when again factors converged to alter film music. Popular music, movies in the 70s, including Jaws, Star Wars, Superman, and others, led to the era of the blockbuster in the 1980s. The blockbuster and the compilation score were brought together by the film industry's interest in films that sold records and records that sold films. And this led to music videos and MTV that looked a little like films, and films that included music video moments that looked a lot like MTV. Music videos, video of music up to this point had been more about conveying a sense of a live performance. You would watch a band playing on stage. And then from this point, music videos became less about conveying a sense of musicians performing and more about creating a feeling or a mood. As movies incorporated these moments of highlighting the hit song from the soundtrack, the editing style changed and the narrative might be paused while the music video moment created a particular mood. You can almost predict when the music video moment is happening because the pacing changes, the editing changes. So some popular films from the 80s, really are remembered almost as much for a key music video moment or the hit song as for the story of the movie. That sound aesthetic carried popular film through the 80s, but by the mid-90s, filmmakers were bored with what had become a somewhat lazy, formulaic way of using music in film. Directors still compiled soundtracks, but they began to feel less tied to playing a song all the way through in a music video moment. Instead, shorter clips from songs might appear throughout the film. Also, compilation scores came to be less unified by theme or genre, where previously the compilation score tended to be all one genre of rock or all jazz or all classical. Compilations in the 90s might and beyond might draw from a wide range of eras and styles, evidenced, of course, in the eclectic soundtracks that Quentin Tarantino and Edgar Wright, Wong Kar-wai, and others are known for. This impulse paired well also with digital music files, which not only allow for easy sharing and endless remixing of playlists, but also inaugurated an era when we now listen to music nearly everywhere and nearly all the time. Another technological innovation that shapes the way filmmakers use music in their movies. That's the era that Wim Wenders' film Until the End of the World was headed toward in 1991. And that movie stands as a testament to that transition point in the compilation soundtrack, bringing us up to the present and to Act 2 of this presentation, Wim Wenders and the film Until the End of the World. Let's backtrack a little bit to some years before the end of the world and find out where Wim Wenders came from and what he was thinking about in planning this ultimate road trip movie. Wenders was part of a group of young German filmmakers in the 1960s and 70s who were restless to challenge the culture they had inherited, or more specifically, the culture that had intentionally been withheld from them by the parent and grandparent generation that refused to talk about the war. It's left a cultural gap that these filmmakers wanted to fill as they wrestled with issues of disappointment with the previous generation. But they were also inspired by the energetic youth culture and rock and roll of their own era, along with what they were seeing from young filmmakers elsewhere in Europe. At the forefront of Wenders' filmmaking ethos in his early films was the idea of the road trip. In fact, 3 of his early major works are now regarded as the Road Trilogy. That's how they're packaged in the Criterion editions. Alice in the Cities, Wrong Move, and Kings of the Road. Wenders valued the pursuit of truth and identity as part of a literal journey across varying landscapes. And some of these early films were in fact created day by day as filming progressed, rather than starting with a complete script. A movie about people on the road naturally needs some kind of musical accompaniment. And so, inspired by movies like Easy Rider and his own lifelong love of rock music, Wenders' characters travel the road to the accompaniment of rock songs on the car stereos and on an amazing number of jukeboxes they find along the way. Alice in the Cities even included live concert footage of Chuck Berry, anticipating future films in which Wenders would feature lengthy performances by musicians. Maybe also the later documentaries about musicians and dancers that have characterized his career more recently. With Paris, Texas in 1984, Wenders turned to the landscapes and character of the American West for the setting of his character's road trip. And then in Wings of Desire in 1987, he returned to Berlin to take a film snapshot of the city just a few years before a pair of momentous world-changing events. The first, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, and the second, of course, U2's recording session at Hansa Studios. Paris, Texas and Wings of Desire brought Wenders enormous international fame. And so as he pushed 1990, he was coming off a career high, but he had an idea for the ultimate road movie for a number of years before that, a country hopping international love story. And this was his opportunity to try to realize that grandiose vision. Back in 1984, when he was still working on Paris, Texas, Wenders wrote a brief sketch of what Until the End of the World would be. And here's what he wrote. A woman in love with a man who, for good reason he believes, is running away from her, pursues him around the world. She is in turn pursued by another man who's in love with her, but whom she is no longer in love with. All 3 are pursued by a couple of crooks who want their money back. They stole it from a bank, and the woman stole it from them in order to pursue her beloved. And then there's a detective who's engaged first by the woman and then in succession by all the other parties to follow whoever it happens to be, or alternatively, to try to shake them off. So it's not that simple after all. It's interesting, and it's surprisingly consistent with what ended up being the first half of the finished film. At this early stage, the sci-fi element of the final movie is missing entirely. And Australia, which is the setting in the second half of the movie, doesn't show up on his list of proposed locations. At this point, sounds like a road trip movie about love, but not yet about images and seeing, which is the extra ingredient that's going to make the finished film. After that initial sketch, Wenders' story expanded in ways that now seem inevitable. He's always been interested in the idea of the image and how people use and understand images all around them. And the interest in images, not just in spectacular, fantastic imagery, but also, maybe especially for Wenders, in the everyday and the mundane. As a child, the first movies he made with a camera his father gave him were simply setting the camera on his windowsill in his bedroom and filming the street below until the film ran out. His father had no idea what was so interesting about that kind of film. But Wenders has continued throughout his career to simply enjoy looking and making images and then contemplating how the images are used. In the 1970s, Wenders often traveled with a Polaroid camera. And a few years ago, he put together a book of some of his Polaroids from that era, which they're actually not fantastic photographs, which is kind of funny to have a book of Polaroid photographs, but they lead to some beautiful reflections by Wenders on the nature of creating and giving and receiving, and how the place of images in our lives have changed over time. And you can probably see, as we're talking about this, just how much this is connecting to what U2 would then play with in the 90s on the Zoot TV tour from a very different angle, but with the same ethos and the same desire to understand image and community and personhood. I hope to present on that at next year's conference, because there's some really interesting connections that it makes sense why Wenders and U2 have been such good friends. So it doesn't seem surprising that the missing ingredient in Until the End of the World was a meditation on the image and on seeing. The sci-fi element of the story involves a camera that can record movies and then translate them directly to brainwaves that allow blind people to see. The process of recording these videos by the person who can see, however, almost leads to blindness for one of the characters. So there's some very interesting seeing and blindness and relationship issues. This is a complex debate, and the situation becomes even more intense when that same technology is used to record people's dreams and allow them to view them over and over on small portable screens. This leads several of the main characters into a state of addiction in which they want to do nothing else during the day other than stare at small devices, rewatching their own dreams. This is 1991, remember? This is before we were all sitting around all day staring at small devices. Wenders' love of the image is not without caution then, that images can be used to build community and relationships, as when you take a Polaroid and then give it to someone, knowing that this is the only copy of this photograph in existence. And so the giving is a very meaningful act. Or images can be used to nurture our own inward focus and obsession, self-obsession, as when we spend more time with the image than with other people, becoming increasingly demanding and impatient with the world around us. So with this story sketched out and plans in place to film in 12 countries and a budget of $20 million, not much compared to a Hollywood blockbuster, but probably one of the biggest budget indie auteur films in history, Wenders pondered a very important question: what will the soundtrack be? It's no surprise at all that he looked to a rock compilation soundtrack as the primary sound of his film. And knowing that his film was to be set 10 years in the future, it starts in 1999 and crosses over into 2000 in the story of the film. He had an interesting idea about creating what would essentially be a compilation score from the future. Songs that mostly didn't exist in 1991, but would exist in 1999. And I want to play, I'm gonna have to unshare and reshare. I'm gonna play a video clip from a recent interview that Wenders did about the music. And we'll hear a little bit about the origin of how he came up with this idea. I'm going to stop the sharing because I didn't do the audio. Okay, here's the audio.
Actually, we started talking and asked him, well, I'm going to make this science fiction film. And Bono said, well,
okay, I'm going to go back to.
I figured in the year 2000 they couldn't just listen to old stuff from the 90s. So I had this bold idea to write to all my favorite bands if they couldn't project themselves into the future. And I did write 20 letters, thinking half of them will say no, or maybe more. And then only 2 said no. So I had a lot of music to deal with, and that was another good reason why the movie had to be so long.
So overall, as I listened to the soundtrack album when it came out, I didn't get a big sense of futuristic music. It's not, it doesn't sound sci-fi-ish to me. It mostly sounded like the groups it was. David Byrne even cheated his way out of the 10 years in the future challenge by proposing that in the future, the Talking Heads, who had disbanded by the time of the movie, would be doing a reunion tour and sounding the same as they ever did. So he contributed a song from the Sessions for the Naked album, which was the last Talking Heads song. REM contributed the new song Fretless, which is a stripped down acoustic sound. And in that way, they actually did accurately predict the near future trend of unplugged rock, in contrast to what might have been a more common assumption that the future would be more electronics and louder sound. And interestingly, this was just before grunge. So Until the End of the World came out in 1991, which is the same year that Nirvana Nevermind and Pearl Jam 10 came out. So this movie is kind of, in some ways, the pinnacle of 80s rock genres, but you can imagine that if it was made just a couple of years later, it might have been a very different soundtrack after the influence of grunge in the Seattle scene. So remembering what we said earlier about how sometimes a compiled soundtrack reflects the music the director was listening to while making the film, here's another excerpt from Wenders about the music he was listening to. I just have to move this forward.
Most of these letters I read were also the musicians I was listening to at the same time. So we listened to all of these people all the time during the shoot. I mean, and sometimes we were driving like 2 hours to the set in Australia. So we needed a lot of music. And that was mainly the music that ended up in the film. We didn't necessarily have the song yet, but we were listening to everything these guys were doing. These guys and girls were doing, so that soundtrack was already very much in our daily life when we were shooting and editing the film.
All right. It's fascinating the way sound and visual and story all influence one another throughout the making of a film. And Wenders really gives himself over to that process, often not quite certain what he wants the final product to be like when he starts out. And in that way, I find his artistic approach very similar to U2's. And so again, I understand the friendship that they've had for all these years. That brings us to Act 3, which is U2 and the song Until the End of the World. We're finally to the U2 part at the U2 conference. Where did the song Until the End of the World come from? It seems like there are two different origin stories that can basically be made to fit together. One is from Wenders, who believes that the song is a direct response to his request for the movie soundtrack. And here he is telling that story.
And it already occurs in the film once before. Elvis Costello wrote a version of Days, and that already appears much earlier in the film. Foreshadow is important. U2 were recording Achtung Baby in Berlin in 1990. It was right after the fall of the wall, and they had rented the Hansa studio in Berlin for half a year, and they always went to eat at the same place, and that was also my cantina. So I ran into them quite often, and eventually we started talking, and I asked them, well, I'm going to make this science fiction film. And Bono said, well, sounds interesting. Send us a piece of the film when you've done it. And it was clearly, yes, we want to do it, but let's first see if you can make that movie.
Do this because we're going to watch the scene in just a few minutes.
Actually, the title Until the End of the World, and then I didn't ask them to write the title track. I had not dared to ask anybody to write the title track, but Bono then sent a tape. Like most of them kept me in the dark what they were doing. They had a scene of the film or already before some pages of the script and the description of the film. And then it was all like Christmas was lasting for a year because every second week I would get a tape. And then I would immediately run to my music room and put it in, listen to it, and it was exciting.
So that's Wenders' idea. From his perspective, it's a song for a movie that was also used on an album. But when U2 talks about the song, they rarely make a big deal about the connection to the film. They always talk about the connection to the Judas and Jesus story and Brendan Kennelly, but they rarely talk about it like it was specific to that movie. And so here's a little clip of the Redbeard interview that some of you listened to recently, I'm sure, where the guys talk about the origin of Until the End of the World.
One of the highlights from the Zoo TV tour was the song Until the End of the World.
That was the first song that was actually finished and mixed on the album. And again, that was like a difficult thing to settle on. You know, there was a lot of experimentation involved. But once we kind of had that one in the can, it was like, well, you know, that's the standard for the rest of the tracks, and we got to get them all up to that.
This was a case of a song that had been around as a piece of music for a while, And I've been struggling. I knew there was something in this guitar idea, but I've been struggling to complete the music, to try and push it in a direction and get it to work. And I came up with a couple of new suggestions, and I sent them off to Bono, who was in Lanzarote working on words. And he was playing around with some words, and he had this other piece which he'd started to write, this conversation between Jesus and Judas. And it was like the two things just seemed to lock. And Until the End of the World then just took on a whole new dimension as well.
So what's the actual origin of Until the End of the World? I think it's probably somewhere in between all of that. That I think we can imagine that that Bono was sketching out lyrics, but I think maybe it wasn't until he heard the phrase "until the end of the world," maybe that's what brought it all together. Because now you can't even imagine the song not culminating in that line every time. But I can imagine that the ideas were there, but it was that concept that brought it together. So it's kind of a collaborative effort. In U2 by U2, they do mention that Wim Wenders requested it, and that was the point when Edge started working on the guitar riff a little more and brought Adam and Larry into it to put something together that's a little more finished, and then had Bono listen to that and put the lyrics with it. So it's a song for a movie that was used on an album, song for an album that was used on a movie. I think it's more the song for an album that was used in a movie, but I think Wenders likes to believe that it was a song for his movie that they asked permission to use on their album. What's interesting is that the version of the song that appears on the soundtrack album is a little different from what was used on Achtung Baby. So especially noticeable is the beginning that doesn't have that very well-known opening. And also the guitar and bass are just mixed really differently. Edge's guitar effects come through very differently in the album version. I think we won't listen to that now because probably many of you have, but at the end I've got that queued up so we can listen to it if you want to at the end. If you listen, interestingly, if you in the movie, it seems like the final mix was used, so it's just on the soundtrack album that it was different. The song plays over the end credits, and it is the album version. And it seems like everything used in the scenes in the movie is the album version. If you listen to the soundtrack on Spotify, it just links to the album version of Until the End of the World, so you don't get the soundtrack version. I was really happy when I got the recent reissue on vinyl of the soundtrack that it is the original soundtrack version, because I really like that version. I remember as a teenager buying that CD and feeling like I discovered some hidden treasure or some mistake or something, that there was this different version of the song. So now we get to what happened once the film finally came together. When discussing the film, I'm referring to the full director's cut of nearly 5 hours, which was released on a Criterion disc in 2019. The initial theatrical and home video releases were a drastically abridged edit of about 2.5 hours, which Wenders calls the Reader's Digest version, and which he really disliked. And critics didn't love it at the time either, but are now returning to it as it was originally intended these years later. It's finding a lot more appreciation, and it is a fascinating and intriguing film. The phrase "until the end of the world" suits the movie well because the characters are living in fear of a nuclear satellite crashing to Earth, which could potentially set off a chain reaction that would annihilate humanity. So at the turn of the millennium, everybody is fearing that this is the end of the world. And Sam Neill's opening narration that explains the situation literally is, "You were talking about the end of the world." The other overarching theme in the movie is dreams, which definitely resonates with the "In My Dreams" of the song. Here's a word cloud of all of the lines in the movie that include the word dreams, and it's pretty overwhelming. Particularly the moment where Sam Neill talks about the people who are addicted to watching their dreams on little screens all day, and he says they're going down into the garden of dreams itself. I just think that resonates with that part of the song also. Parts of U2's song are heard in 3 scenes in the first half of the movie, and then the full song returns in the end credits. In fact, it's the only song in the end credits. We'll take a look at each of the 3 scenes and consider how Wenders has taken elements of the song to match something in that moment of the film. And when also just a caution as we get into this, we do want to be cautious about getting lost in lyrical analysis of film music. So writing about the music of Wes Anderson, for example, Ben Winters writes about the temptation to look for narrative meaning in film music, which is all the more alluring when words are involved, and specifically about Anderson's film, but this works with anything. Rather than examining them for narrative implications of their texts, Anderson's musical choices might be more fruitfully examined for their registral content, for the easily understood vernacular, stylistic, or generic markers that indicate appropriateness for the sound of their sound for the scenes. And Alfred Hitchcock also regarded music as just one element of the total soundscape of the film. After all, he said, when you put music to film, it's really sound. It isn't music per se. So we can't assume that the words of a song or its original meaning have anything to do with the director's choice to include the song in a scene. However, and Until the End of the World, I see some really interesting connections between U2's lyrics and what's happening on screen. And from what I know of Wenders' work, I think it's worth considering, as we'll do in watching these scenes together. So in each scene, we'll ask a few questions. How does the song match the action in the scene? How do the lyrics interact with what the characters are thinking or experiencing? And is the song used diegetically? That is, are the characters hearing it, or is it underscore? Is it just for us? So the first scene comes in at about 27 minutes into the film. And I'm gonna get these queued up, and I'm sure hoping this works. So let's give this a try. All right, so I'm going to share this, and we'll watch the first little bit of Until the End of the World in Until the End of the World.
Et attendez, il faut que je coupe la mousse.
Ça va tenir jusqu'à Paris, non?
Ouais, pas de problème. Si vous avez envie de vous faire remarquer, avec la chantilly...
Hi, me again.
Hi.
Would you give me a lift?
I don't think that's a very good idea.
Oh,
There's a guy looking for you.
yeah, I know.
He's got a gun.
I know. Oh. Could you go? He's coming. Please. Go. Go.
What's he after?
So there's our first scene where you hear Until the End of the World. This is pretty early in the movie. Claire, the protagonist, is just driving out of a repair shop where a cracked windshield from an accident has been repaired. And the U2 song is playing, and we initially can't tell if it's diegetic or underscore. But then when Sam comes in and he gets into her car and closes the car door, the song gets muffled. And so we realize, they were actually playing that in the garage. So that was the cue that this is something they're really hearing. In this early scene, we're still not quite sure what kind of movie this is. It's not the sci-fi movie yet. It seems like it's a noir chase, and now it seems like maybe there's a romance. So these two have just briefly met, and then he shows up again, surprisingly, and asks her to drive him away because he's being pursued. So we have the feeling there may be romance, and this is just kind of an unusual beginning to the film's love story. And it's interesting here that Wenders takes just this bit of U2's song, just the instrumental bit, and then at the end, Bono's saying love, 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 which seems to be cueing that, like, he wants us to think that this is the beginning of the love story, like this is a genuine love, love, love. And so it doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the song yet. He's just pulled out this one little bit to paint the color of what he wants you to be thinking about in this scene. So it's teasing us. It's perhaps confirming what the characters might be feeling and thinking about. So it's working with the scene as the movie, but not in the meaning of the full song. All right, the second scene comes about an hour and 18 minutes into the film. And we'll just we'll watch that one here.
Yeah, about bloody time, too. I already paid for the carpet. Haven't I seen you somewhere before?
Possible. Anyway, what are you going to do with all that money?
Well, we could start with a drink.
So in this scene, we see Claire entering a train station, and she sees the same bounty hunter who was chasing Sam in the garage. So he's still pursuing him. And the bit of U2's song that's used here is interesting because the lyrics really do seem to fit what's going on, even though, again, it's not the meaning of the original song. It's just the meaning as Wenders is using it to paint his narrative. So in fact, it has been a little while since Claire has seen this guy. They've spoken before, but that's before everything happened with Sam. So it has been a while since they haven't seen each other for quite a while. And then as she walks up towards him, puts on her disguise and walks up towards him, we hear we're as close together as a bride and groom, which is interesting because the last time Sam and Claire worked together before the scene, they were definitely as close together as a bride and groom. So it's like the song is sort of giving us what Claire's thinking or matching what she's thinking, triggered by seeing this guy who was pursuing the man she's in love with. And then we ate the food, we drank the wine, everyone having a good time at just the moment that Claire and this guy are about to go off and have food and have drinks. So again, it's interesting because it has nothing to do with the original meaning of the song, but it fits the movie perfectly. So Wenders has very carefully chosen this and placed it. Now we'll go to the third scene. It's a little longer, and it's about the halfway point in the movie. And it's a little rougher in language and content than the other two, so that's just a warning. But we'll see, especially in this one, what's diegetic and what's underscore, and how are the words attached to this scene.
Look, this is you.
Tell me about it.
I've got nothing. I'm not from here.
You're from Sunday. You got something I wanted. Don't move. Everybody's going down. Waves of regret, waves of joy. I reached out for the one I tried to destroy. You said you'd wait till the end of the world.
So in this scene, Sam and Claire in San Francisco, they're broke, they're down and out, things are really bad, and she's in a bad neighborhood on her own. And so we see some shots of her, we see some shots of what she's filming with the camera that she carries around with her in this movie. And it definitely looks like she's trying to drown her sorrows, but is being overwhelmed. So we're seeing a lot of darkness, which matches some of the tone of the song. And then Wenders specifically makes this cut where he cuts straight to the love, love, love part. And you probably notice like the song doesn't go like it's supposed to. He splices it together. And the love, love, love seems almost ironic here because we're not seeing any love, we're seeing darkness. It's also the moment when we see Claire with a young child sharing her images, sharing her movies with the child. And so maybe it's not ironic. Maybe this is the song telling Claire that she needs to be love and be light in the world, or maybe that this child is innocent and still has love. Anyway, it's an interesting cut. Diegetically, or music-wise, it's diegetic for the first little bit. It seems like this is a song that's probably coming from one of the car stereos or a stereo on the street. But then when the scene shifts to Sam walking through San Francisco, it changes, it fills out. And so then we know he's not hearing the song, we're just still hearing it because now it's underscore, not diegetic. So it just shifts a couple of different times in that in that scene. So in just these few minutes of a nearly 5-hour movie, I'm going to stop the sharing and go back to our PowerPoint. In just these few minutes of a nearly 5-hour long movie, we see the movie as right at the transition point that we talked about in the 1980s approach to film music and the mid-90s and beyond. So the score is a compilation, but not entirely. There's also specially composed music, orchestral music throughout. So Wenders was bold in his choices, but he wasn't quite willing to let go of the orchestral underscore entirely. Not like a year later, Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs would launch his career relying entirely on the compilation score. Most of the songs included in the film are, as we were saying, the pinnacle of 80s rock at the time, but looking ahead to the later 90s. So for all those reasons, and because of a number of sci-fi predictions in the movie that really became quite accurate later on, the film at its full length is now an excellent milestone of that era of film and music history. And that is U2 and Until the End of the World. It was a long journey, but we got there. I'm interested to hear feedback from you and think about what you think about the way Wenders used the song, and if it affects your understanding of the song at all, that it was used in this way right about the same time as Achtung Baby came out. There's the scenes. And going back to our original themes with the innovations in technology, we could talk about 91 era technology that was influencing U2 and Wim Wenders. We can talk about how we see and understand Till the End of the World differently now from when it was released originally because of changes in technology and listening and consuming. We can talk about visual style influencing sound and vice versa. And then fourth is one I think I'm most interested in, the choices in filmmaking and the question, who owns the meaning of Until the End of the World? Who created it? So anyway, these are some of the questions I have. I know we just have a few minutes left, but I would love to hear from all of you. Anybody who'd like to talk, you can just unmute and speak out.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that I think goes to that last question on your slide about choices in filmmaking from Christopher. Why do you think Wenders used a different mix in the film?
He's never talked about it. I've never found anybody who's actually given a reason why the soundtrack mix is different. My guess is just that he got an earlier version and used that because the record company needed it before he finished his final cut of the movie. So that's my only guess, but it's very interesting because it's not a version, it's not the kindergarten version, it's not like any of the other versions that appear anywhere, it's just on that soundtrack and it's really good.
There's another question from Mitchell. It seems like there is or was some tension between the band and Wenders. Do you know if this is true and are they in touch today?
I don't know. I haven't heard about anything coming up between them. I know Wenders, of course, made Bono's $1 Million Hotel and they've done a lot of things together. So I haven't heard anything, but I don't know for sure.
Weren't they just did Bono and I think Edge just show up at the anniversary showing of this movie?
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, I think there was an anniversary showing. It may have been a Cannes or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think both Bono and Edge showed up, so they seem to be on good terms.
Oh, great.
I was thinking about the choice by the director to, in any film, to use the music diegetically versus underscore. And using it diegetically then, of course, implies that in that film's universe, the characters know that song. And I just think like that's, when the director makes that choice, what are they trying to say by the characters knowing that song? I don't know, so just a thought in my head.
Yeah, there's a lot of, in film music studies, there's a lot of talk about that it's almost like the characters have some power to influence the sound. And so sometimes when you hear a diegetic song, you can almost think of it like this character is exerting power to make this song happen because it's reflecting something they're thinking about or struggling with. So it's not just a song that came on the radio and they happened to hear it, but it's almost like an extra layer of dialogue between the audience and the characters in the story.
Do we have any final questions for Neil? It was a really fascinating presentation and I loved all the film clips. That really helped it was great to hear the music in the movie.
It's a good movie, and if you can get that Criterion version, that's the full length version, it's quite a thing to watch a 4.5-hour movie in one go, but it's really good. It's hard to really know where everything's going the first time, but then you really appreciate it when you start thinking about it. It's just beautifully filmed. So for the song and for the whole movie, it's worth checking out to see what it's like.
All right. Well, oh, sorry, Ian, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I saw this movie once years ago, and it was a bit of a process to get through it, like a lot of Wim Wenders movies are. But yeah, after this, yeah, I'm gonna check it out again.
All right.
Oh, David is saying Criterion films are often available at 50% directly from them or at Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, in fact,
Or from your
Barnes and
local
Noble-
library.
Yeah, library would have it. Barnes and Noble does Criterion sales in November and July. So I think the November one is still on. For anybody who's in the US, you could get the Blu-ray for about $20, I think, which is a steal. It's a good set.
Disc? What's a disc?
Oh, come on.
Says the guy with all the CDs in the back.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It was great to connect with you, and I'm just looking forward to the rest of the conference. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Thanks so much.